I like to keep my promises. We will resume in just a moment as our special keynote speaker comes in. And I want to welcome National Security Advisor to President Biden, Jake Sullivan, and the Arms Control Association's board chairman, Tom Countryman, up to the stage. Tom will introduce Jake, and we will have some time after Mr. Sullivan's address for questions. We'll start with reporters, and then we'll go to the audience. Tom will provide further instructions. Tom, over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Daryl. Welcome. We will be brief in the introduction because you didn't come to hear me. You came for the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. Let me just note that after his remarks, we will take a couple of questions from the press pool here, and then a couple of questions from the audience. If you would like to ask a question, jot it down on the pads by your chair and hold it up, and our staff will collect it. What brings us together as an association is our belief that America's national security and global security depend upon prudent restraint in nuclear policy and upon an active effort led by the United States to constantly reduce the risks of nuclear war and to fulfill our legal obligations shared by other nations to negotiate in good faith the reduction and eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. To our meeting last year, President Biden wrote that perhaps more than any other time since the Cold War, we must work to reduce the risk of an arms race or nuclear escalation. Arms control and non-proliferation diplomacy continues to be an essential part of safeguarding global security. I think it's a good thing that we've never had before a president with such long and intense experience in nuclear policy as our current president. I think that President Biden is fortunate to have Jake Sullivan advising him on these issues, and we are both fortunate and honored to have him here today. Please give him a good welcome. Jake. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for that very important set of introductory comments and for the kind words. And I also want to thank Daryl for bringing us all together today. And most importantly, I want to thank all of you for giving me the opportunity to just say a few words here this morning. 60 years ago next month, in grainy black and white video, President Kennedy addressed the nation. He was sitting behind the same resolute desk that President Biden sits behind now nearly every day, and that I sit across from him nearly every day. My fellow citizens, he said, I speak to you tonight in a spirit of hope. Negotiations were concluded in Moscow on a treaty to ban all nuclear tests. After years of nonstop negotiations, or stop and start negotiations to be more precise, years of dialogue, years of commitment and courage, establishing the nuclear test ban treaty was a huge moment, not only for our own national security, but for the security and stability of the world. And as this group knows well, it was one of the first steps that would slowly usher in an era of responsible arms control and nuclear deterrence measures. An era where nations could compartmentalize the issues of strategic stability, even if they couldn't cooperate on much anything else. An era where adversaries could disagree and debate across basically every domain, but could find ways to work together to limit nuclear risk. An era where world leaders chose transparency even during times of tension, especially during times of tension, because what was at stake was too important, too vital to our shared future. That is the foundation of nuclear stability and security that we've depended on for decades. And it's the foundation that the Arms Control Association has helped to uphold across generations. But over the last few years, that foundation has begun to erode. And today, we now stand at what our president would call an inflection point in our nuclear stability and security, a point that demands new strategies for achieving the same goal we've held since the Cold War: reduce the risk of nuclear conflict. So today, I'd like to lay out what we're endeavoring to do in pursuit of this. I'll start with the cracks in the foundation that we see, the new threats that are challenging the post-Cold War nuclear order, and then I'll walk through how we are trying to adapt both our nuclear deterrence and our arms control strategies to meet this moment. As we've all seen recently, some of the major cracks in our nuclear foundation have come from Russia. Last year, Russian forces recklessly attacked and seized the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, the largest operational nuclear plant in Europe, with little concern for the potential catastrophic consequences of a nuclear incident. Earlier this year, President Putin unlawfully suspended Russia's implementation of the New START treaty that places limits on the most destructive weapons in our arsenals, the kinds that could destroy the world many times over. Only a month later, President Putin began to take steps to station tactical nuclear weapons in Belarus. And, as we all saw just a few days ago, Putin formally announced that he will withdraw from the Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe, putting the final nail in the coffin of an agreement that once served as a cornerstone of European security, which Moscow began violating years ago. But even prior to Russia's brutal assault on Ukraine, Putin has been destabilizing the nuclear foundation our forebears laid. For years, he's advanced the development of dangerous new nuclear capabilities like radiation-spewing nuclear-powered cruise missiles, all while modernizing and stockpiling old capabilities that aren't regulated by arms control agreements, like theater range missiles and torpedoes. Russia's actions have been dealing body blows to the post-Cold War nuclear arms control framework. But it's not just Russia that we have to look to consider the full scope of the context we find ourselves in today with respect to nuclear security and stability. We've also seen a change in approach from the People's Republic of China. By 2035, the PRC is on track to have as many as 1,500 nuclear warheads, one of the largest peacetime nuclear buildups in history. But unlike Russia, who is threatening to walk away from the negotiating table, from the arms control agreements our countries have relied upon for years, the PRC has thus far opted not to come to the table for substantive dialogue on arms control. It has declined to share the size and scope of its nuclear forces or to provide launch notifications. And it has not shown much interest in discussions regarding the changes it is making to its nuclear forces. Simply put, we have not yet seen a willingness from the PRC to compartmentalize strategic stability from broader issues in the relationship. And that compartmentalization, as I noted before, has been the bedrock of nuclear security, indeed strategic stability, for decades. Finally, we're seeing increasing nuclear threats from the DPRK and Iran. In the last year alone, Kim Jong-un declared that he aimed to have, quote, the world's most powerful nuclear arsenal, announcing plans to ramp up the development of everything from tactical nukes to ICBMs to unmanned underwater nuclear weapons. He announced a sweeping new nuclear forces policy law that would permit Pyongyang to use nuclear weapons first against non-nuclear states in direct violation of the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. And he has tested more ballistic missiles than any other period in the DPRK's history. On Iran, after the previous administration's departure from a deal that put strict limits on Tehran's nuclear development and prevented it from obtaining a nuclear weapon, Iran's nuclear program was left unconstrained. As a result, Iran is now operating more advanced centrifuges. It has enriched more uranium, including at levels closer to weapons grade, and it has done so with less international monitoring of its program than when it was under the strict constraints of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. Taken together, the cracks in our post-Cold War nuclear foundation are substantial and they are deep. And today, we're entering a new era, one that demands new strategies and solutions to achieve the goals we've always had. Prevent an arms race, reduce the risk of misperception and escalation, and most importantly, ensure the safety and security of our people and people around the world from nuclear threats. Same goals, new strategy. That's the core of our approach to strategic stability, one that can be boiled down to two main lines of effort. First, update our deterrence capabilities and plans, and second, advance new arms control and risk reduction measures. These are two sides of the same proverbial nuclear coin. Responsibly enhancing our deterrent capabilities allows us to negotiate arms control from a position of strength and confidence, and new arms control helps limit and shape our adversaries' decisions on nuclear capabilities. And so today I'd like to spend a little time discussing each of these sides of the nuclear coin. I'll start with the deterrent side of the coin, where we're taking a two-pronged approach. First, we're modernizing our nuclear program here at home. In practice, that means replacing each leg of our nuclear triad, land-based ICBMs, ballistic missile submarines, and nuclear-capable bombers. It means updating our nuclear command, control, and communications architecture by replacing aging capabilities with next-generation systems. And it means investing in our nuclear complex and defense industry to help ensure that we have a responsive nuclear enterprise and a resilient base for long-term competition. And I want to be clear here. The United States does not need to increase our nuclear forces to outnumber the combined total of our competitors in order to successfully deter them. We've been there. We've learned that lesson. Nor does the United States need to deploy ever more dangerous nuclear weapons to maintain deterrence. Rather, effective deterrence means that we have a better approach, not a more approach. It means ensuring that we have the capacity and capabilities necessary to deter, and if necessary, defeat major aggression against our country, our allies, and our partners. So to enhance that effectiveness, we're investing in cutting-edge, non-nuclear capabilities that will help sustain our military advantage for decades to come. Capabilities like conventionally armed hypersonic missiles that can reach heavily defended high-value targets, in contrast to the nuclear-capable missiles of similar kind that Russia and China are developing. And capabilities like new space and cyberspace tools that will help the United States retain its advantage across every domain. Together, these modernization efforts will ensure our deterrent capabilities remain secure and strong as we head into the 2030s, when the United States will need to deter two near-peer nuclear powers for the first time in its history. But we can't go at it alone, which leads me to the second prong of our deterrence strategy, investing in and strengthening our alliances abroad. That has been President Biden's overriding priority, indeed, in many ways, his strategic North Star since his very first day as President of the United States. And as we've worked to further deepen our alliances, we've always remembered that one of our greatest non-proliferation accomplishments of the nuclear age has been U.S. extended deterrence, which has reassured so many of our partners that they do not need to develop nuclear weapons of their own. For example, in April, the President reaffirmed our ironclad mutual defense treaty with the Republic of Korea, including our extended deterrence commitment. And together with President Yoon, he signed the Washington Declaration, a step that created more mechanisms for cooperation between our two countries, including during a potential nuclear crisis, and showed a recommitment to our shared non-proliferation objectives. Together with our NATO allies, we've been laser-focused on modernizing the alliance's nuclear capabilities, from ensuring broad participation in the alliance's nuclear deterrent mission to certifying our F-35 aircraft to be able to deliver modern nuclear gravity bombs. All of these new steps, from revitalizing our nuclear program here at home to reinvigorating our alliances abroad, and all of the elements that fall in those two categories, are necessary in their own right. But taken together, they've helped achieve the same strategic stability goals we've always had. They'll show our adversaries and competitors that in an arms race with the United States, that any arms race with the United States is counterproductive at best and destructive at worst. And they'll help the United States negotiate arms control agreements from that position of strength and confidence I described. those arms control agreements are the other side of the nuclear coin, which is what I'd like to turn to next. Nearly 20 years ago, when then Senator Biden addressed the Arms Control Association, and Tom talked about President Biden's very longstanding commitment to non-proliferation objectives and his long experience in being a leader in this space. He said, quote, "We must invent new approaches and foster new international cooperation to meet changing threats." Those words only ring more true today. And under the president's leadership, we're advancing 3 new approaches to strengthen arms control and decrease nuclear risks in this changing nuclear age. First, we have stated our willingness to engage in bilateral arms control discussions with Russia and with China without preconditions. And before I jump into this, let me just step back and say that without preconditions does not mean without accountability. We'll still hold nuclear powers accountable for reckless behavior, and we'll still hold our adversaries and competitors responsible for upholding nuclear agreements. For example, the United States will continue to notify Russia in advance of ballistic missile launches and major strategic exercises in line with pre-existing nuclear agreements. But yesterday, we adopted lawful, proportionate, and reversible countermeasures in response to Russia's violations of New START, including suspending our day-to-day notifications to Russia that are a part of the treaty. These steps will help guarantee that Russia does not receive benefits from a treaty they refuse to abide by, and that the principle of reciprocity, a key tenet of strategic arms control, is upheld. It will also demonstrate to Russia the benefits of returning to full compliance, including once again receiving detailed information regarding our nuclear forces, a conversation we continue to press for directly with Russian officials. But while claiming to suspend New START, Russia has also publicly committed to adhere to the treaty's central limits, indicating a potential willingness to continue limiting strategic nuclear forces through 2026. We agree. It is in neither of our countries' interest to embark on an open-ended competition in strategic nuclear forces, and we're prepared to stick to the central limits as long as Russia does. And rather than waiting to resolve all of our bilateral differences, the United States is ready to engage Russia now to manage nuclear risks and develop a post-2026 arms control framework. We are prepared to enter into those discussions. Now, the type of limits the United States can agree to after the treaty expires will, of course, be impacted by the size and scale of China's nuclear buildup. That's why we're also ready to engage China without preconditions, helping ensure that competition is managed and that competition does not veer into conflict. It's our hope that among the topics on the table for diplomatic discussion, Beijing will be willing to include substantive engagement on strategic nuclear issues, which would benefit the security of both of our countries and the security of the entire world. Next, the United States is willing to engage in new multilateral arms control efforts, including through the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, the P5, the United States, Russia, China, the United Kingdom, and France. We're under no illusions that reaching risk reduction and arms control measures in that setting will be easy, but we do believe it is possible. And as you all know, 4 of the 5 nuclear powers are, with some exceptions that I just mentioned, already de facto committed to some transparency and restraint in their nuclear policies and postures. The US, the UK, and France have also all demonstrated their commitments repeatedly to responsible behavior. And some of the P5 have nuclear agreements with each other. For example, the US and Russia have a ballistic missile launch notification agreement with each other, which I mentioned before. So do Russia and China. But these existing agreements are limited and piecemeal. We can do more. The P5 provides an opportunity to manage nuclear risk and arms race pressures through a mix of dialogue, transparency, and agreements. For example, formalizing a missile launch notification regime across the P5 is a straightforward measure that is simply common sense. It's a small step that would help reduce the risk of misperception and miscalculation in times of crisis, and one that could potentially build more momentum towards further measures to manage nuclear risks and arms racing. From maintaining a human in the loop for command, control, and employment of nuclear weapons, to establishing crisis communications channels among the P5 capitals, to committing to transparency on nuclear policy, doctrine, and budgeting, to setting up guardrails for managing the interplay between non-nuclear strategic capabilities and nuclear deterrence. These are all areas where we could take further steps in a multilateral context working among the P5. This leads to my third and final point. The United States will step up to help set the norms and shore up the values of the new nuclear era. We're already making some progress, including across every major multilateral body that seeks to limit nuclear or WMD risks. The Non-Proliferation Treaty Review Conference, the Conference on Disarmament, the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Biological Weapons Convention. Across all of these forums, we're leading results-based discussions, and we're ensuring that our frameworks are fit for the threats we face today and tomorrow. For example, the fielding of weapons based on emerging technologies will create new, interconnected, and unpredictable escalation pathways. So we're working to establish new guardrails, especially in space and cyberspace. And of course, with the advent of artificial intelligence, this entire picture only becomes more complex and challenging and requires the new kinds of approaches that I've been describing throughout the speech. The approach that we are looking at takes into account technologies and tools that could complicate a potential nuclear conflict, like hypersonic weapons, like AI-enabled systems. And as the president often says, we're making sure that we're leading not just by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. That's why we've committed to not conduct destructive, direct descent anti-satellite missile testing. And we're encouraging our allies, partners, and competitors to do the same. And it's why we put forth principles for responsible behavior in space and principles for the use of AI in the military domain, both of which we are actively promoting in international fora. Let me close with this. 60 years ago, President Kennedy spoke to our nation in the spirit of hope. That's how he put it, the spirit of hope. Hope that we could safely manage strategic competition, that we would one day build a world free of nuclear weapons, that we could forge a future of greater peace, greater stability, and greater security, not just for Americans, but for everyone. Today, as we face new threats, and as we face those cracks in our post-Cold War nuclear foundation, I not only believe that we can find this hope again, I believe that we must. Because when it comes to nuclear risks, what is at stake for our people and for our world is too important, too consequential for our shared futures not to. We are under no illusions about the task at hand, of the hard work and likely the long work needed to help lay a new, stronger foundation for this era. But through new deterrence and arms control measures, one fit for this age, we can turn this moment of peril into a moment of possibility. And I look forward to working with all of you to do just that. And I'm looking forward to the conversation this morning. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much, Jake. Appreciate it. Is this mic on already? Okay. I'm certainly heartened to hear that the U.S. remains not just open, but committed to activist search for solutions. I think you covered so many topics, there's going to be a lot of questions, and we're going to start, I think, with a couple from the press. Let's go with Michael Gordon.
Michael Gordon, Wall Street Journal. Jake, when the New START Treaty was agreed, it was assumed that 1,550 START-accountable strategic nuclear warheads would be sufficient to deter a like-size Russian strategic force. You've taken note of the Chinese buildup, and a growing number of experts are concluding that if 1,550 was necessary in the past, surely something larger is required to deter both China and Russia, especially since there's a degree of military cooperation between these two powers. My question to you is, Do you think the U.S. might need to increase its arsenal beyond 1550 in order to deter China and Russia and give China an incentive to negotiate? And what would be required in terms of arms control with Russia, changes in nuclear strategy, and dialogue with China to make it possible to stay at the current level of 1550 and perhaps go lower?
Well, first, as I said in my speech, we are prepared to abide by the central limits of the New START treaty. And we have indicated, the Russians have indicated they are willing to as well. I said in my speech, we agree with that. We agree with the Russian position. Second, I think it's important to recognize that when it comes to the issue of the growing nuclear capacity of both Russia and China, that deterrence has to be comprehensive. And that means modernizing our nuclear arsenal, as I described before. It means investing in extended deterrence in our alliances, as I described in the speech, and it means increasing our non-nuclear conventional strategic capacity in ways that help enhance our overall deterrence too. And we think putting all of those pieces together, we believe in the current context, we have the number and type of capabilities today that we need. I can't speak to every context and contingency way out into the future, but as things stand today, we believe that we have what we need. In terms of the question on China and what it will take, look, the very first thing that is necessary is for us to get this conversation going in a real way. And I believe that the PRC could make the bold decision to engage directly with the United States in discussions of strategic stability and nuclear risk. And that it would be the responsible thing to do for the benefit of our two countries, and as I said before, for the benefit of the wider world. Once in that conversation, the question of each side's leverage, incentives, carrots, sticks, and so forth can be defined, but we have to pass that first threshold first, and we have not, as of yet, seen the PRC be willing to engage in that conversation.
Okay, we'll have time for one or two questions from the audience if we keep questions brief. Let's stick with the media. Jonathan Landay.
Thank you. Jonathan Landay with Reuters. Given Russia's recent actions, its invasion of Ukraine, its rhetoric, its nuclear saber-rattling rhetoric, the suspension of New START, why do you think Vladimir Putin would be even interested now in discussing nuclear risk management and a follow-on to New START?
Well, first I would point out, as I did in the speech, that throughout the Cold War, our Soviet adversaries engaged in all kinds of military aggression, adventurism, destructive and brutal practices, and engaged in arms control discussions and strategic stability discussions with the United States of America. The Soviet Union and subsequently Russia were able to compartmentalize the issue of strategic stability and nuclear risk as it related to the two largest nuclear powers from other policies that they were pursuing and other issues in the relationship between the United States and Russia and previously the Soviet Union. So I can't predict exactly what Vladimir Putin will do, but there is a track record of our two countries being capable of engaging in these kinds of discussions in a way that serves our respective national interests and the broader common interest. That's what the United States is saying we're available to have. We're available with clear eyes, as I laid out the litany of steps that Russia has taken to put cracks into that post-Cold War nuclear order, and the difficulty of reaching any kind of meaningful, enforceable, verifiable understanding. I said it would be hard work and long work, but the notion of Russia being prepared to at least engage in the conversation is rooted in the historical experience of our two countries.
And Teresa Hitchens, please.
Hi, I'm Teresa Hitchens with Breaking Defense. Just yesterday, Defense Secretary Austin bemoaned the fact that China has been unwilling to engage in military-to-military communications across the board, from activities in the South China Sea all the way to space. And you just mentioned their unwillingness in the nuclear arena. Do you have any insights into how, or can you share any insights into how the administration hopes to be able to break that impasse? Because right now you have silence on the other end.
Look, ultimately, China's a sovereign country. It's going to have to make its decisions about whether to engage in the kind of responsible military-to-military dialogue that is necessary to manage competition responsibly and reduce the risk of conflict. We can only do what is right and responsible and rooted in our national interest, and that is to say, we're available for that kind of dialogue. We're available for building those military-to-military mechanisms. We're available for crisis communication, and we're available for strategic discussions about everything from space to cyberspace to nuclear stability. That's something we say not to come out and demand something from China or to, get down and beg for them to come talk to us. We just say, we're ready to talk when you're ready to talk. And frankly, the rest of the world should look at this question and say, what does it mean to be a responsible, significant power in the world? Doesn't it mean actually being prepared to engage in military-to-military communications, particularly where our militaries are operating in close proximity and where these strategic issues have deep and fundamental stakes for the entire world? I think most countries would answer that yes. I had the opportunity to spend 2 days in Vienna with Wang Yi, the Politburo lead for foreign affairs in the PRC system. And without going into the details of that conversation, which I think both he and I are respecting the discretion of, this was a topic I broached with him. I thought that we had a candid discussion on it, and we will continue to indicate our willingness to participate in these discussions on a going forward basis, and we'll see what the PRC chooses to do.
Thank you. We've received several questions from the audience, more than we can share, but I'll give them to you for as much time as you can give us, and you've been generous already. First, you've seen Senator Cotton's bill to pull out of New START and significantly hamper future arms control efforts as we approach the National Defense Authorization Act. What is your message to Congress on why efforts such as this are counterproductive?
Well, first I will send them a copy of the speech so that maybe they can all read it. I'm not going to comment on any particular piece of legislation that's been put forward, only to say that we believe that remaining in the posture where we are prepared to pursue meaningful arms control agreements has had a long bipartisan history in this country. President Biden knows that better than anyone, having worked with Republicans on many of these. And when New START was passed, of course, it was passed on a substantial bipartisan basis, including with the stewardship of one of the then champions of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Lugar of Indiana. And so, we would make an argument for a continued bipartisan commitment to this core tenet of America's national security strategy, which is the willingness of the U.S. to engage in reciprocal, verifiable arms control arrangements. And we will continue to make the case that anything that would inhibit that or block that would not be in the American national interest.
Okay. Thank you. What happened, the second question, what happened to candidate Biden's advocacy of a sole purpose nuclear doctrine? That is, the sole purpose of U.S. nuclear weapons should be to deter or respond to nuclear threats against the U.S. or its allies.
Well, as you all know, when President Biden came into office, he immediately directed his relevant national security cabinet agencies to engage in a nuclear posture review, which is the responsibility of a new president when they came in. And that requires looking at both the context in the world and taking a hard look at our own capabilities and posture at home. And when he took a look at that, and he sat down with Secretary Austin, Secretary Blinken, Chairman Milley, and other key players in the nuclear security enterprise, he reached the conclusion that the declaratory policy as set out in the Nuclear Posture Review was right and fit for purpose for this moment. And we believe that it indicates continued commitment from the president's perspective to try to, on the one hand, ensure a credible deterrent, and on the other hand, work to reduce the role and risk of nuclear weapons in the United States on a in the world on a going forward basis.
Okay. Finally, I wanted to note that we have with us as our lunchtime speaker, Austrian Ambassador Alexander Kement, one of the driving forces behind the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which, as you know, is a new element in the global nuclear risk reduction equation. Does the Biden White House welcome this treaty's contribution to reducing nuclear threats.
Hi, Ambassador. How are you? So, President Biden was recently in Hiroshima, Japan, and he wrote an inscription at the Peace Memorial where he wrote about a future that we can all one day work towards, of a world without nuclear weapons. That is something that he supported as vice president and long before that, and continues to look to that future. So the basic principle, the basic thrust of efforts to work in that direction are not inconsistent with the Biden administration's approach to these issues, but the particular instrument, of course, is quite different from what I just described in my speech. And so we have our policy that we are pursuing. Others are putting forward different ways of trying to ultimately get to that long-term objective. We believe that we do need to deal with the challenges and threats that we face and confront in the national security landscape today, and that requires these two elements, as I laid out in my speech, a nuclear deterrence element and an arms control element. And so I'll leave people to judge for themselves rather than try to get into a debate here as to how that kind of relates to these other efforts like the treaty that you described.
Okay. I want to thank you. There are no doubt about 150 people in this room who would like to debate things with you.
Sure there are.
We appreciate your time. We instead will pressure, debate, and Hector, Cara, and Pranay, and their colleagues at the White House and at the State Department and Defense Department. As I think all of us appreciate, there's so many countries that have made a contribution to keeping the world safer, to building an arms control and non-proliferation architecture that, as you note, is under threat. It's my personal belief that we have only succeeded in putting together those pieces when the U.S. is determined to show a leadership, not only an openness, but an activist approach. So we welcome your comments today. I want to ask everybody here to stay in their seats and to allow Mr. Sullivan to leave and get back to a normally busy day.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you very much.
Thank all of you very much.
Thank you, Jake. It's terrific. Okay. Let me add a personal note also to thank Representative Beyer for being with us today. Both when I was in government and now outside of government, I have always worked hard to increase the attention that members of Congress and their staff pay to nuclear issues. Sadly, I see that attention level decreasing in recent years. And to have you here today, sir, and to know about your leadership of the bicameral working group is very important to us, and part of what I hope everybody sees as their mission to continue to reach out to and to educate members of Congress, to get them to share your interest in the existential questions that we deal with. Now, we are a little bit ahead of schedule. What I would like to do, unless Daryl tells me different, is to give you a coffee break, to ask Kathy to ring a very loud bell at about 10:23 and to ask you to be back in your seats by 10:25. We will start the next panel at 10:30 sharp. Any questions? Good. All right, thank you.